Greetings, Planeswalkers. It's Chris, aka NAS, with Commander the Gathering. I hope all is going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. With all of that said, I have to give a little bit of context. This series of Friday Night Magic started when a buddy of mine, Old Bearby, whose channel I will link below as I've been forgetting, started conversing about Magic the Gathering with me. Fast forward, it culminated in me starting this series where I intend to go through all of my 60 some odd and counting commander decks. Normally, Old Bearby and his brother Tommy Bear would pick a number, but for the next, what will it be, this episode and the following three, there will be no choosing as we are in the midst of exploring a box of 5 decks. Last bit of maintenance, what we have gone through so far is deck number 7, the Scarab God, deck number 11, Admiral Becket Brass, deck number 40, Kamahl, Fist of Krosa, deck number 1, Unesh, deck number 57, Edgar Markov, deck number 62, Firesong and Sunspeaker, deck number 3, Mizzix, and number 59, Morophon. All of that out of the way, we can get back into Bolas's Citadel. This time we rest our eyes upon the Scorpion God, the second of 3 gods in this box, with the first being Scarab God. Before anything else, let's read the card because it explains the card. The Scorpion God is a 6/5 god. Thanks all. See you next week for Friday. No, wait, I think there's more. Oh yes, quite a bit. He costs 3 generic and a black and a red for a total of 5. His first ability reads, whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, draw a card. This is any creature for any reason. Next, I can tap for 1 generic, a red, and a black to put a -1/-1 counter on a target creature. Tertiary, and same with our buddy Scary Gary, not to be confused with Ashy Gary. And last episode, I botched this and kept saying at the end of the upkeep, but the way it really reads is when Scorpion God and Scarab God die, return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So what that means is, regardless of whose turn it is, if he dies and instead of opting to put him into my command zone, I decide to put him into the graveyard and risk him getting stolen or taken or whatever, at that end step, he will bounce back to my hand for me to play at the appropriate time. I have named this deck Scorpion God, God Slayer Eternal. This is for 2 reasons, and they both meshed well as I went through and redid this deck for the video. The first is simply the mechanic of the Scorpion God. What I mean is that traditionally, gods were indestructible, mainly as of Theros. Then the Amonkhet gods too were indestructible. Scorpion God and Scarab God represent the way they broke away from that, but instead instilled a new way for them to represent the eternal nature of gods or immortality, in that they bounce back to your hand to be replayed as opposed to being indestructible. That first piece out of the way, the other is that the Scorpion God has an easy way to mitigate indestructibility. -1, -1 counters. So basically a 6/6 indestructible god with 6 -1/-1 counters on them is a 0/0 god, aka a dead god. So he has the ability to destroy and kill even indestructible gods. So tying that with the lore above, and with him having killed Amonkhet gods, this whole deck seemed very fitting. So in this deck, you're going to see quite a few of other gods and a lot of counters and a lot of killing. So let's dive in. First, per the norm, let's start with lands. Visually, let's look at Desert of the Fervent and Glorified. Both are here for a few reasons, actually. First, yes, they're Bolas and Amonkhet themed. The later being the home of the Scorpion God and Scarab God and Bolas's whole plan on the named Amonkhet plane. but they also give color access or cycle for card draw. But they're also a desert subtype, so keep that in mind for a moment. Another desert from Amonkhet, but this one is colorless and Grasping Dunes. The non-mana ability obviously meshes well with this deck. Next we have Ifnir Deadlands, yet another, but I think the last desert. This adds colorless and you can potentially add black mana for a price, but the tertiary ability is the one I enjoy most, allowing me to sacrifice a desert for counters. -1/-1 counters. That includes the all three prior aforementioned deserts, although it's cheaper for me to use Grasping Dunes by itself because of its cheaper price. So I have the option to play them normally, or cycle them, or I can drop them and sack them to Ifnir Deadlands to put counters somewhere. Onto artifacts and our mana optimizers, starting with Soul Ring and 2 medallions, Jet and Ruby respectively, and then a pair of diamonds, Charcoal and Fire. Rakdos Cluestone's there, and that also allows late game draw, and Worn Power Stone with Unstable Obelisk. This is here to be able to target things other than creatures with counters. Not much equipment to see in this deck, but we have Lightning Greaves and Blightsicle, or as I like to say it all together, just have a nice Blightsicle, which gives an equipped creature Wither, dealing all damage in form of -1/-1 counters. Static artifacts, as I call them, start with Glaring Spotlight. Again, making sure I can omit hexproof and actually target as this deck needs to. And with that said, this card is cheap. I highly recommend it. In many, there's not a glaring spotlight in my boxes sitting around. Any deck that has to target something, I can fit this. It's a one drop, and again, the second mode is just phenomenal. Weathered Runestone is here to ruin, or Weathered Ruin, Weathered Rune, yeah, whatever, we'll just edit that out. So the Weathered Runestone is here to potentially ruin someone's graveyard synergy. I always tell people, new players especially, that just because you have a card in your hand, it does not mean that you have to play it. This card can hinder a few cards I have in this deck. However, this card can devastate and cripple graveyard decks, and that can be worth more than the few couple times or small handful of times that it may potentially handicap me. Hearthstone is similar to Training Grounds that you may have seen in the prior Scarab God deck, but this costs 3 colorless as opposed to 1 blue in Training Grounds, and only reduces activated ability costs by 1 instead of 2. And then, with that extra mana, I can maybe put that into Rings of Brighthearth and copy some abilities. Cauldron of Souls is a great new add to this deck. I'm so glad I found it. A little bit more on that later. But then we have the Planar Bridge, which I may remove, but it's a pseudo form of tutor in this deck, and it works. And then there's the main reason I hold it in high regard is that unlike most tutor spells, you can do this next turn. Or if you have a way to untap it and the mana, because it is expensive to use, then you can just do it again and again, or just wait your next turn and use it again. Moving on to instance, now we have Rakdos Charm. Modes and potential. It can, again, ruin a graveyard strategy. It can destroy a key artifact on the battlefield, or it can turn a, quote, go wide plan against an opponent by pinging them for each creature they have. So now that army of 10 1/1 soldiers does 10 damage to their controller. This can be a great thing to have in hand before, or if you're playing a deck like Krenko or Nagila, those decks that just go wide and almost out of nowhere, and they have that finishing blow coming. And if they do, you can just interrupt combat with this and deal that damage to that player, hopefully knocking them out. Seething Song and Dark Ritual are both great for instant speed mana burst. Grim Affliction and Torment of Venom both add -1, -1 counters, and then both do a little more beyond that. With those counters, and if Scorpion God is on the board, Terminate and Unlicensed Disintegration can remove a creature and net a card. An Hour of Glory. Yes, that is Scorpion God killing another god, and just perfect for this deck. The only bummer is that it exiles, in that if there's a -1, -1 counter on that creature, it doesn't technically die or go to the graveyard, so I would not draw a card for it. But it just feels so good. Onto the slower side of the slinging, we have Torrent of Souls, and this is a 2-mode card in 1. I can play it for 4 generic and then either red or black, but likely a bit of both. If you pay its cost and only use colorless and red, your creatures all get +2/+0 and gain haste until the end of turn. If you use colorless and black, you bring a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, and if you use both, you net both of those. Obviously, stacking the ability so that the creature hits the battlefield first, then you stack and put the red trigger next, which would give all your creatures +2/+0 in haste, including that key creature that just came out. This is one of those cards negated by the Runestone. Just got to make sure we edit that out. The Runestone. But I can still use the 1 mode to give haste and the buff, whether Runestone is in play or not. Make sure we edit that out. Totally. Then the next we have just straight artifact hate. By Force and Vandal Blast, let me destroy. It's great. Lethal Sting is neat. There are so many ways to interact with this, just a great card. Then Increasing Ambition, a tutor. This card's flashback would be negated by Runestone being on the field, but again, I still get the basic use out of it, and if this card is in my hand, and so is Runestone, I have no reason to play Runestone. Unless I do, because, again, at that point, is it worth me not being able to tutor for a card to be able to play that and completely lock down an opponent? Yes. Enchantments here do so much work. More so, I would argue, than Scarab Gods, maybe. Crumbling Ashes kills a creature with a -1, -1 counter on it at your upkeep. Of note, this is not a May ability. So, if I happen to have a -1, -1 counter on one of my creatures, and there are no other -1, -1 counters on an opponent's creature, I have to select mine and kill it. Fevered Convulsions is a way for me to do that, though. Put that -1, -1 counter on a creature. I love me some Volrath, too. Impact Tremors, because we're just going to ping everybody. And similar but in a different vein, we're going to also overrun them with Nest of Scarabs. Scarab God sends his regards. Everlasting Torment. Yes, just everything down to the flavor text. It fits the god, it fits the deck, everything. Blowfly Infestation just keeps the party and the fun going. Grandfather Nurgle would be proud. And side by side with Pestilence, it just seems to be a Nurgle party up in here today. And on the corn side of the house, Gratuitous Violence and Havoc Festival. In Gratuitous Violence, you just double combat damage. And to keep games going for too long, and just because, what is it that they say?
I care not from where the blood flows, only that it flows. Blood for the blood god! Scouts for the skull throne!
With cards like these, the end is always nigh. Now on to the characters. We're going to start with a couple themed cards, then move on to others before the last group, which is our little surprise. But not just yet. But first we glimpse upon Soulscar Mage, who converts all non-combat damage to opponent's creatures into -1/-1 counters. And then Sickle Ripper with built-in Wither. Banewhip Punisher, an easy include in this deck. And then Kolrath Knight, a gem in this deck. This can be a potential game ender and just make me want to swing for the fences. And Rakdos, last of the themed cards. It's a showstopper potentially. And now Labyrinth Raptor is just so amazing in this deck because you can play it for its 2 mana, then even though it has Summoning Sickness, pay the 2 to pump its friends, and even if it cannot attack itself, that ability is relevant based on the wording. Royal Assassin kills tapped creature, and sweetheart, you have to wait. You can't be so impatient. Don't tip your hand. Whisper Blood Liturgist allows me some graveyard recursion, unless the Ruin Stone is afoot. Steel Hellkite, because why not have a colorless dragon who Rakdos can help me cast for free, and with a bunch of great abilities. Harvester of Souls is there for card draw and a little bit of intimidation. And then Ryusei, another dragon who punishes opponents for killing it, or if I want to punish the board, I can target it and kill it or sacrifice it myself. Oblivion Sower, another cast trigger, so even if this is countered, I still net that effect. And spoiler alert, if you're the one who just countered it, I'm going to target you with that effect. Also helping cast is Conduit of Ruin. That ability is just so wonderful. Premier in this deck. I love it. Vein Drinker, it does a lot. Enjoy the read for a moment. Deathbringer Thactor adds counter interactions, but in the positive side, which can help negate -1/-1 counters on it or some of my other creatures. And then we have the Last Dragon, Tyrant's Familiar, now with Lieutenant. Razaketh, who can help me tutor for life or can just help me trample you out of existence. And then, always the odd one out, the Void Winnower. Just generally an unfun card to play against. Now, this is where I got creative. So, the Scorpion God is a god killer, a god slayer. So, again, as mentioned all the way back at the beginning, that carries so well into the -1/-1 counter aspect. This deck will consist of more gods now. Gods conquered, vanquished, and collected by the Scorpion God. Please note, this is not canon in MTG lore. Not all of it, anyway, as he has actually killed several gods in Amonkhet. But that context aside, let's just take a little glimpse. Let's look at the gods' gods. Starting light, and you can kind of consider these 2 slots just maybe being kept warm for other people. I do have, after all, an entire set of Stargazer Secret Lair drops to open. But first, we have, focus here, focus. First we have Anax and Temerit, 2 demigods from Theros. I may actually keep Temerit as he adds flavor, being a demigod, and a lot more function than Anax. I'm big on graveyard hate, more so when it is directed and at instant speed. Specifically, this is why. Similar with Scarab God, actually, he and Temerit can both do as follows. Let's say it's your turn. You have a creature, or maybe your commander in the graveyard. You cast a spell or activate an ability to either move him or her or them, in the case of Mina and Den, to your hand or directly to the battlefield. In response, I can now activate my ability to remove, exile that card you targeted, and my effect will go on to the stack. And as the stack resolves down, my ability will hit first, removing that. Then after that, when your spell hits, that spell will no longer even be there to target, and just, mwah, I love it. It's just blue and black hate. Oh, sorry, I was reminiscing. Next we have Bergie, and it's a new card from Kaldheim. It is mainly here for ramp and a lot of flavor, but the flip side can have potential value, especially if I'm desperate or if I'm just going for the throat. Bantu is an Amonkhet god, and with this one, as mentioned before, note the indestructibility. In that same vein, we have Mogus and Perforos. Both do great. Mogus with sack options and direct damage, devotion, indestructible. Similar, Perforos has his indestructible, but man, this card is great in any deck it goes in, and in this deck, it's no exception. Toralf, another Kaldheim card. I want to put this in so many decks. Specifically this, if I can get a second copy of this, it's going to go in a Karavek deck that I have. One of my favorite decks because it's just perfect. Which is why it's here. Tegrid, another Kaldheim, the god of fright, and quite a bit more on her later. And then last is the new and perhaps tweaked Perforos. It's almost as good and in many situations and ways probably better than the other. So, while the Scarab God is mustering his army of prior mortal Eternals, the Scorpion God vanquishes god after god, only to raise them as Eternals, ready to serve the God Pharaoh. And with that fun out of the way, let's do some combo talk. So Tergrid and her abilities. First off, without me doing anything but casting her, this can punish and lock down people who use sacrifice lands, shutting them down quickly. Lots of players use basic Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, but a lot of other decks, especially high-powered ones, tend to use more upper-end lands that sacrifice to grab other lands, and this can stop them, or you can net a benefit from it. And similarly, there are lots of commanders, or just decks in general, that have sacking strategies. I'm talking to you, Marin of Clan Neltoth. Labyrinth Raptor adds that sack potential, as does Torment of Venom, and Mogus puts that pressure on people also. Rakdos, as mentioned, he can be a complete showstopper in this deck. That last ability can do so much. So in essence, if I deal just say 3 damage to you this turn, I can then cast Rakdos, and then all creature spells I cast cost 3 less per the damage that I dealt to you until the end of the turn. This just can lead to some explosive turns. And I'm likely to do more than 3 damage per turn, but if we just stick with that number, all of these cards you see, including my commander, the Scorpion God, I can now play reduced by 3 mana. And that can just be a lot of fun and not good news for the opponent. Scorpion God's key ability is that when a creature with a -1/-1 counter dies, I get to draw a card. So with Scorpion out, and let's say Soul Scar Mage, or even better, Everlasting Torment, things get crazy with Nest of Scarabs. Add Pestilence, and let's see how this works. If there are 3 creatures on the board, and I have Scorpion God, and if Everlasting Torment, Pestilence, and Nest of Scarabs are also out, if I activate Pestilence just one time with a black mana, I will get 4 1/1 bugs. I will get 1 for the 3 creatures my opponents have, and the Scorpion God, each getting a -1/-1 counter. So now I just produce an extra 3 1/1 bugs. If I produce 1 more black mana and do that again, those 3 bugs I just got will all die. So now that will draw me 3 cards from Scarab God. With that said, I will now get 7 more bugs. 3 for my opponent's creatures, 3 from my bugs that just died and drew me cards, and then 1 going on Scorpion God. And at that point, I'm assuming no other creatures from my opponent's 3 died, but if they have 2 2s, that creature would be dead. A 1/1 would have died the first time and potentially drew me a card. And that's how this starts to cycle. It makes me want to put Phyrexian Altar and Ashnod's Altar in here, and I may try to find a home in here for them. And then just take one moment and think about all of that happening with Impact Tremors or Perforos out there, as Impact Tremors would deal 1 damage to each opponent for each snake or creature in general that comes out, and Perforos deals 2 damage to each opponent for the same. So that's the potential in this deck. Thank you very much for hanging out with me, and congratulations on making it this far. I hope everything's going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. This is Chris, aka NAS, with Commander the Gathering. We'll catch you on the next one.